Hello, Graham. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Hello. Yes, it's a pleasure to be present
Great.
on your
So,
Quakerology series.
yes, indeed. So let's start by getting to know you a little bit then in terms of your Quaker journey. Can you tell us a bit about how you came to be a Quaker, how long ago that was, that kind of story, and what were you seeking and what did you find?
It's a bit of a long story, and it's had certain ups and downs. In fact, I only became a Quaker member in 2016. Um, when I was at school, um, I I lived in a slum area of Birmingham, a working class area, and I had no books in my home apart from a battered encyclopedia, um, which was published in 1913. Um, and, and I had to get my information from that. But I also got a lot of enlightenment from my Baptist Sunday school. And I went there for some years. Um, I loved it, actually. We used to read the Bible. Uh, if you memorized the whole gospel by heart, then you got a prize for them. And so I tried to memorize St. Matthew's gospel and got through a lot of it, but I didn't get to the crucifixion. Um, I, uh, I, it was a bit contradictory because my mother was very anti-church.
Mm.
She, I mean, I was sent to Sunday school on a Sunday to get me out the way, basically, so that they could have some free time. And but neither of them was religious. She was nominally Anglican, and my father was nominally Catholic, Irish. And uh, she was very anti-church. The Anglican Church owned some of the slum properties, and the local vicar was an oppressive slum landlord. So my grandmother, for example, he wanted to evict her because uh, the house was bigger than the others and he could rent it out for more rent. So he wouldn't do any repairs and the water used to stream down the walls and so forth. And there was another local vicar who seduced a girl in his congregation. And in the Baptist church to which I went, there was um, all sorts of rumors, I suppose, about boys being molested. And as a result of that, my parents said I couldn't go to the Baptist camp, summer camp, which I wanted to go to. Um, so they were very hostile to it. Um, and I had a friend called Johnny. And when I passed the 11 plus, we were separated. Um, I was the only boy in my school who passed the 11 plus. Um, and so I was cut off then. I went away to grammar school, which was geographically and culturally distant. And so I broke with those friends because I didn't have the same interests eventually. And at the grammar school, there were lots of kids from professional families. They had books in the house, books in the plural, not just my one. And they had holidays in France, and they arrived at the age of 11 speaking French. Um, so there was that terrible contrast there. And I tried to overcome this by inviting Johnny to an event at the Baptist Sunday School. This was a preacher from America called Billy Graham.
All right.
You will have heard of him. So the idea was that if Johnny could come along with me on Sunday to church, I could keep up the friendship with him because I didn't see him any longer during the week. So he came to this meeting, and Billy Graham was, of course, a very powerful speaker. He talked about Jesus being nailed to the cross and the blood, and how the blood and the pain was for us. And he talked about hell and how we ought to avoid it, and described a bit of hellfire and so on. And my friend Johnny was absolutely terrified. And by the end, he was reduced to tears. So he didn't become religious, quite the opposite. He went in the opposite direction. And this brought all sorts of questions into my mind about the Baptist faith I was attached to. There was a military wing to it as well. We used to have a military band and march through Birmingham, centre of Birmingham, with a sort of marching routine and a military step, which I wasn't very happy about either. So one day I went into a junk shop, and I was looking through it, and I found a book. And it so happened that my mother had started to give me pocket money, because she'd found out that the boys at the posh grammar school had pocket money, and she didn't want to be downgraded, as it were. So she got together some pocket money. And I was in this shop with my pocket money, and there was a book there. And on it, it said, George Fox, the Journal. So I looked at this book, and it was full of all the stuff that I'd learned by heart at this Sunday school, and more. And I bought it. And I went home, and that day and the following weeks, I was utterly transfixed by it. And it really transformed my life. From then on, George Fox was my eternal hero and a spiritual guide, forever, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and I felt when Fox said about the light, I actually felt the light. I felt that I was feeling the light streaming in from Christ while I was reading. So it was my. You see, I'd gone to Baptist church all these years and never had a religious experience. I went into a junk shop and found I, who wasn't wanted in my home area and wasn't wanted in the grammar school. I found Fox, who wasn't wanted, and he'd been thrown into a junk shop. So I felt he was reaching out to a fellow sufferer across the
Yeah.
3 centuries. So it was a sort of big moment. So what happened then was that I went eventually to university, and the same thing happened again, in that I was cut off both from my home territory and from the territory I'd arrived on by education. But but this time it was disastrous. It was catastrophic. Um, the jump from back-to-back houses in a slum area to a grammar school in Edgbaston was a bit of a leap. Um, but to go from the slum areas of Birmingham to Oxford University, that was a bigger jump. That was a
Mm.
jump that was almost impossible. And I must confess that there was a character defect involved in this because I I I was very shy and I had a bit of a stammer and
Mm.
I didn't talk to other people. And I think perhaps in the grammar school too, but also certainly at the university, I I didn't talk about any problems to my fellow students or to my tutors, um, partly because it was such a huge problem that I'd got, and partly because I just wasn't the type of person who did that sort of talking. And the two together were difficult. Also, I hadn't understood the George Fox properly. So, um, first of all, well, it wasn't that I hadn't understood George Fox properly. What it was I think I'd kept my Baptist training. And during university, if I had the problems that I had, I would try and pray. And I think I prayed in the Baptist way and not in the George Fox way. Now,
Mm.
you might say, well, after reading George Fox, why didn't I go to a Quaker meeting? I didn't know there were Quaker meetings. I only found there were Quaker meetings sort of decades later. It's one of these things. If you come from that background, there are all these gaps in your knowledge.
Mm.
My parents left school at 14.
Mm.
The only newspaper they read was the Daily Mirror. Um, as I say, there were no. Well, after I passed the 11 plus, I did get books given to me then, I didn't have many even so. And so I was isolated, um, and and so I used to when I tried praying when I was at university, I got the wrong idea. I used to pray to to find help for myself or to find help for my situation of not being able to mix with, a roommate who was off every weekend in his Aston Martin to the country house. Um, and uh, and so I prayed in a way that was self-serving. If I'd remembered St. Matthew, I mean, I did remember St. Matthew's. I learned it by heart. But if I'd really remembered it, I'd have known that sort of God knows everything you want before you ask, and so you don't have to ask, and you shouldn't pray publicly. And there was a lot of rules of prayer there, but there was also blasphemy. Do not take the name of the Lord in vain.
Mm.
So I was using God or Christ as a sort of helpline. So I would sort of my prayer would be like, um, "Hello, God. This is Graham. I've got this problem. Can you sort it?" That sort of thing. And and of course that wasn't right. Eventually, in retrospect, I went back to George Fox and I realized that he never did any of that. That he he was led. So when he was in a field in the Midlands and he looked across the field and he saw the spires of the Lichfield Church, he looked at them and he said, I saw the spires of Lichfield Church and they struck at my life. So he didn't pray for guidance. He took
Mm.
off his shoes, walked across the icy fields, went as led uh, into Lichfield, walked up and down the main street, saying, "Woe to the bloody city of Lichfield," or town of Lichfield, and then came back, not knowing why he'd done it. Um, so he hadn't been instructed, um, yet I was sort of hoping God would help me with the syllabus, things like that, uh,
Mm. Mm.
which was completely wrong-headed. Um, Now it's interesting that there was a Quaker Meeting House I found out later, just a few hundred yards from the college where I was, and I
Yeah.
never walked past it. I never saw it. And if I'd gone in there, all this would have been explained to me, perhaps. But
Yeah. Yeah.
I wasn't led in that particular case. Um, so what happened then? So it, the university was a disaster. I got very depressed, stayed depressed after university, didn't know what I was going to do because originally I'd hoped to study history, and I was going to study religious history, and I would study the great nonconformists like George Fox and John Wesley and all that, and I would give the definitive account of
Mm.
their lives as a historian. Um, so that was gone, and um, and also I was still isolated because the education that I'd received cut me off from all my family and friends, and I hadn't really made uh,
Mm.
many uh, good friends amongst the public school boards. I have to say that when I went to university, only 1% of the students there were on full grant, and many didn't have any grant at all. It was means tested.
Mm.
So I was the only working class boy in my college.
Yeah.
So, and the the lecturers, the dons, didn't have a clue about what I was talking about, basically. And I didn't know anything that they were talking about either. They would my um, my tutor would say things like, "Well, when you've been in Chartres and you've looked at Chartres Cathedral, what were your impressions of the medieval and this sort of thing?" Yeah, I could have said, "Well, my mum and dad have been on a day trip to Boulogne," something like that, but it just didn't seem right. Um, so there was all that, and how did I come out of it? Well, um, a few years later, uh, there were two things really that got me out of this plight. One was that I met Sheila and got married.
Mm.
Second was uh, that I looked at the television one day, and they had the Vietnam War uh, on the screen every day for years and years and years. And the Vietnam War made sort of Gaza and the Ukraine war like a tea party.
Mm.
Um, there were poverty-stricken peasants in Southeast Asia, and on them, American invaders dropped more bombs than they had dropped in the entire Second World War, including chemical weapons. Um, and I wasn't interested in politics. I hated politics. Um, and that was one of the big problems I had at university, actually, because I didn't really, I mean, chose to do history. I thought I was getting away from politics and going into the past.
Mm.
My mum was conservative and my dad was very strongly Labour, and they used to argue bitterly. And so I hated politics and anything to do with it. Um,
Mm.
so so I didn't know what the Vietnam War was about at the time. I didn't read the newspapers. Um, I was so anti-politics that I didn't vote until I was 28. Um, I didn't read, when I stopped reading my parents' Daily Mirror, I didn't take another paper. Uh, but I saw this news item, and there was a man in yellow robes, saffron robes, a Buddhist monk, and he crossed the street and sat down at the side of the road, and he had a can, and it was a petrol, and he poured the petrol over himself, and he struck a match, and he sat in a sort of lotus position uh, until he burned to death. They didn't show the whole of it on television, but they just showed a little bit. And then he sort of, without a murmur or a protest or a spasm, and then when his body was completely black, because I saw the whole thing later, he just fell forward on his face dead. And well, I mean, the first thing I thought of was Fox's Book of Martyrs, not my Fox, but the other Fox, and all the martyrs that had been burnt by Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth in the 16th century. That was the first thing because of my religious outlook. Um, and um, uh, and then the second thing was to get me interested in this phenomenon. This here was an ethical, spiritual phenomenon on my television screen, and I hadn't seen that before. And then in the 60s, as it pursued, I found there were many more of these people. There was Mandela going to life imprisonment. There was, Muhammad Ali refusing to serve in the American army. Um, you know, I'm not going to kill any Viet Cong. They they didn't lynch my father. They didn't rape my mother. My enemy is here at home in the United States. All that sort of thing was on television. And and then uh, there was uh, there was some missionaries, Christian missionaries, who were in China, and they described the Long March in China, which again was full of spiritual and ethical choices. Uh, and then there was Cuba. There was Che Guevara and Castro. And I read uh, Guevara's history of the Revolutionary War. And there were not, I mean, it was powerful. He said, at the risk, well, he didn't say that in this book, different source. He said, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, I must say that an essential part of being a revolutionary is to have a powerful feeling of love. And then he described a scene in the Sierra Madre, in the forest, vast forest in Cuba, where they hid from the American-backed dictatorship and its warplanes and troops for many years. And there was an incident, again, which really struck me, sort of spiritually, which was one of the men in the group, by accident, it seemed, pulled the trigger on his gun and shot a comrade, shot him dead. And the majority of the group, majority of the guerrilla band, wanted capital punishment. For one thing, he might have done it deliberately and be a spy for the dictatorship. For another thing, they liked the bloke he shot. For another thing, discipline was discipline. And they had this meeting of all the guerrilla fighters in a in a clearance in the forest, described in detail by Che. And it went on for hours, with the majority of the guerrillas wanting to execute this bloke, and Che Guevara and Fidel Castro wanting to stop it. But they believed in persuasion. They didn't believe in, in some other revolutionary groups, the leader would have just gone up and shot this bloke and moved on. But that, as I say, they were moved by love and truth, and so they had to do it by persuasion. So it went on into darkness. They had to make little lights so they could see each other in shadow, not too big in case warplanes spotted them to kill them. But they took the time off while threatened by being killed by a cruel dictatorship to discuss an ethical question for hours. Yeah. And so this, I mean, I'd sort of abandoned my ethics and religion after the disaster at university. So all this was drawing me back
Mm-hmm.
to spiritual and ethical connections. So they went on for hours, and then they had the vote, and Che Guevara and Fidel won by a very narrow margin. It was something like 146 to 130 something. It was close because the man they'd shot was popular. Um, the man who'd been shot, sorry, was popular with the others. So the next thing that I noticed in some left-wing journal, which I was now reading left-wing journals, but not not really party politically, but just from the humanitarian, I suppose, point of view. And it said, debate Quakers and leading Quakers and leaders of the Communist Party are debating. And there was this debate, and the Quaker that impressed me was a man called William Barton, and he was the leading international Quaker for Quakers in Britain in the Cold War. He was fluent in Russian, and he was backed up by a half Quaker. This was a man called Paul Oestreicher, and Paul Oestreicher was a half Quaker because his parents were Quakers, and then he'd become Anglican. And then later on, after this debate, he went back to being a Quaker, and he still is a Quaker, as far as I know. He now lives in New Zealand. And he's very, very old. Anyway, I listened to this debate, and it was interesting for me because William Barton had studied Marxism and socialism, and he said clearly Marx was a Jewish prophet. Clearly, Marxism and socialism are heresies of the Judeo-Christian tradition, and they have the same ethical values. And Marx tries to sound tough and factual and clinical and objective, but you can't go very far in Marx without realizing that he feels passionately for the poor and passionately for the injustices of society. However, he tries to make it sound scientific. And then Paul Oestreicher um, said similar things, but from a different angle because he knew the Anglican Church and the other churches. So he was trying to connect it with the whole of Christianity. So I was very impressed by this discussion. First of all, it confirmed a conviction I had that um, that somehow that ethical and spiritual and religious and humanitarian and social were all one complex of things. They were all the same.
Mm.
And I look back at my George Fox, which was my eternal companion uh, on my bookshelves, and yes, I could see it now. Uh, he said he said thee and thou to everybody, and got beaten up every time he said it. Well, not every time, often. And that was a statement of equality because the rich people used to address the poorer ones with thee and thou, um, uh, because that was what they used for their children and for their servants. And then there was the question of hats, taking off your hat to a social superior, which Fox refused to do and got beaten up again and uh, imprisoned even several times. So, and then of course, there were the attacks on the church. The journal is full of attacks on the church for their tithes and the stupidity of the clergy, um, and their arrogance. And of course, you've got to separate Anglican Church then from now, because at that time it was a state church in the full sense. The Anglican Church was the propaganda wing of the state.
Mm.
Um, and the Parliament was a Puritan Parliament which hated Quakers. In fact, George Fox got more toleration from King Charles II than he got from the Puritans. Um, but it was all to do with equality. Peace came later, as you know, but equality came first. So, with what had been said by Oestreicher and by William Barton about um, socialism being a heresy of the Christian Church, um, I, I I saw the whole thing, and I have to say that uh, as well as that sort of moment of illumination when I first read George Fox and the whole world seemed illumined by the light he was talking about,
Mm.
I used to get flashbacks of that all through my life. I've always, sometimes quite unexpectedly, I feel that the universe is whole. It's one thing. That there is a whole spirit in the universe. Um, I, I, I don't use the word um, God very often because because it's got all the old connotations. Whereas I came to think of God as an energy, some
Mm.
sort of positive energy in the universe, not an old man with a beard or some sort of tyrant who ordered Abraham to kill his son. Um, that's I had a different view. Uh, so so I went on with that in the 70s, and uh, I was involved in lots of picket lines, demonstrations, confrontations with police, non-violent and pacifist on my side, but not on the police's side. uh, I, I had some bruises. Um, and uh, Oh, yes, one other thing I should perhaps mention. I'd read a lot of Albert Schweitzer, who was very pro-Quaker.
Right.
He went into philosophy and history. And he also Arnold Toynbee, the historian, the spiritual historian, Arnold Toynbee, who looked at the history of civilizations and found that each civilization had a different spiritual ethos. And then Schweitzer became a hero of mine because he explained this word ethic. And that was all important as far as I was concerned. But what Schweitzer did in his books, he showed um, that there was an error called mysticism throughout religious history. And this error was an error because it detached people from the world. And then there was another error um, on the opposite side, which was too attached to the world. Both sides failed. So the monk who never left the cloister, um, or the uh, Buddhist who um, fasted themselves to death, um, that was the wrong way. And people who got too immersed in the everyday took a wrong course as well. What you needed was an ethic. You had to extract from your religion. It didn't matter um, which religion it was, whether it was Buddhism, Islam, or Christianity. As Schweitzer pointed out, the Quaker doctrine of the light makes clear that the light comes to all men in all parts of the world, even atheists and Roman pagans, even Roman centurions who asked Jesus to cure their daughter. So he was clear about that. So anybody can do it, you know. But you have to have some sort of ethic. You have to work out some sort of way of sort of starting with mysticism and ending with society, but without going too far and losing your mysticism in the social work that you're doing. Do you see what I mean? So I found that very, very informative, considering the position that I was in myself.
Mm.
Uh, then again came total disaster. In 1978, I was involved in an important strike, historic strike, called the Grunwick strike. And I met this wonderful woman on the picket line. She was a leader of the Grunwick workers. They were East African Indian refugees, many from Idi Amin, who was a dictator at that time. And she was a Hindu, but she had a religious take on Hinduism. Not all Hindus have a religious take on Hinduism, but she did. And she Jayaben, and she and I used to stand on this picket line, and she used to teach me spiritual things. So I remember one day um, some passerby came over and said to her, "Why don't you get back to Pakiland where you belong?" And I sort of bristled, and Jabin put a hand on my arm and said, "No, Graham, no. Um, uh, just ignore people like that. Those people are ignorant of history."
Mm.
She appealed to me as a historian. So, and then she told me all about Indian women who'd been famous in Indian history, even led armies into battle. And she told me about Indian spirituality, and she was a disciple of Gandhi, and how wonderful Gandhi was. um, and got me really interested in Gandhi. So Gandhi and Schweitzer, Toynbee, were my 20th century heroes, whereas Fox was my more ancient one. You know. So uh, the disaster came because the strike was crushed. We didn't know at the time, but um, there was a woman working behind the scenes who was masterminding a vast network to defeat this strike and to bring down the Labour government at the time. This woman was Margaret Thatcher, and she was the patron, really, of an organisation called the National Association for Freedom. And they organised this employer to defeat the picket lines and defeat the strikers, even though we had the miners on our side and came down to the picket lines to support us. It still ended in defeat. And uh, and that was the beginning of the end then, because after that, the left, as you know, was defeated in the 1980s and 90s, and we we came into a very dark period. And for me, it, I took all this personally. I must say, I took all these defeats personally. I I didn't want to see Jayabin in tears. Uh, I didn't want to see good, ethical people in tears and ruthless politicians
Mm.
in victory. Um, I still despised politics and politicians, and I despised them even more because the Labour politicians didn't seem to be any better than the Conservative ones. Compassion was not their language. Um, so the next 20 odd years, I was again in the same sort of depression, really. Oh, not really depression, but yes, it was depression. uh, but it was mainly that I was drifting. Just after, as I was after university, I was drifting. Um, my religious faith had been destroyed at university because it sounds silly, doesn't it? God hadn't answered my prayers. You know? Well, at least He hadn't comforted me anyway. Um, and and then I joined what I thought was an ethical socialist left-wing movement based on ethics and honesty and love. Yeah, uh, and now that was crushed, um, really crushed. You know, crushed by police on horseback with batons,
Mm.
um, crushed by mass unemployment and miners committing suicide. Um, so so I took it badly. uh, yeah, it didn't turn round until uh, about 2004, and I got, well, 2003. I got involved in the protest movement against the Iraq War and met one or two Quakers in it. And I uh, met some ethical people as well as the standard politicos who just wanted to recruit for their faction or party or something. Although I must say that they were often the majority of those. Um, and so I started to remember all my idealism of the 60s, you know, started to flood back, you know, all the Paul Erstreicher and Che Guevara and uh, Arnold Toynbee, the Albert Schweitzer, George Fox, all that sort of came back to me. And then, so I started to participate more in what I call the social movement to distinguish it from what I call politics. There is a problem here because some people think that protest is politics, and I don't.
Mm.
So there's something there that always has to be ironed out.
Okay.
I think of it as against politics. When I'm on a demonstration or on a picket line, I'm against politics because the politicians should have sorted this out. There shouldn't be this confrontation. Um, People who loved the country and bore witness to truth would never allow these situations of poverty and injustice to exist. Um, and so the real turning point was that I remember uh, a relative of ours died in prison. And by that stage, I'd occasionally called in to Westminster Meeting House in the centre of London.
Mm.
They had a half an hour silence on a Tuesday lunchtime, a, a quick silence for people who were at work in London. And so I I used to go along to that occasionally. They told me I was an occasional attender, uh, and I saw a notice on the notice board there because I'd started to read their literature, and there was a notice on the board, and it said um, Britain Yearly Meeting, and I thought, oh, perhaps I'd find out more if I went along to that. And they said, oh no, you've got to be a member, really. Uh, and I said, and I suddenly looked, and it said Salter Lecture, Anne Hours, Chief, Her Majesty's Chief Prison Inspector, is doing a lecture on prisons. Now, I'd just been involved with this inquest on this relative who died in prison.
Right.
I thought, oh, that's great. I thought if the Quakers, I'm not a member, if I go to a friend's house and they try and stop me going to this lecture because I'm not a member, I'll find a way around it. I mean, I haven't been on all those picket lines and demonstrations for nothing. I know my way around, you know. I'll get in. so, so I went along with my wife, and it was absolutely wonderful. So I went in, and it was packed. The light at friend's house, call it the light now, was packed as Quaker socialist meetings sometimes are if they have a star speaker, you know. And she was a star speaker. So we went in, and there was this wonderful silence, which I'd never experienced before. 5 minutes of silence at the beginning. And everyone was so concentrated. It was created a hush that really penetrated. And, and because of the topic as well, I was really moved by it, I suppose. And and then the meeting was chaired, clerked, uh, by an actor, Quaker actor called Ian Flintoff from Oxford Meeting. And being an actor, he spoke very well. But then Anne Hours was so kind and thoughtful. This was the woman in charge of our prisons, you know, so kind and thoughtful and so insightful. And and then afterwards in the discussion, um, the Quakers who stood up, they were so well informed and so caring. And I dare say, in retrospect, one or two of them may have been Quaker chaplains.
Mm.
And as you know, Quaker chaplains are very good. um, but they made good speakers. And so uh, the overall impression was really stunning. You know, this was this was a social commitment by ethical and spiritual people. That was what I'd wanted all along, you know,
Mm.
from the beginning. Um, People were able to do that balancing act that Albert Schweitzer spoke about, you know, neither being trapped in mysticism nor being trapped in everyday life, but finding the words that would take you into a balance between the two. Um, and
Mm.
they got it, you know, they got that. And so I joined the Quaker Socialist Society on the spot, uh, and and this was now my way forward. Uh, so uh, I started to go to Westminster meeting more often. I went on Wednesdays when there was a three-quarters of an hour meeting, and then big moment. I went on Sundays for the whole hour. I graduated up to the big one, the whole hour treatment. Um, yeah, it took about 2 years to get up to that level. Uh, so, uh, but I was intrigued by why it was a Salter lecture. Now, it so happened that I'd read the biography of Alfred Salter as part of Labour socialist history and to do with with the locality where I lived by Fenner Brockway. It was brilliantly written, wonderful biography. Even now, it's very moving. And Alfred was another one of these people you could uh, wonder at. And I mean, let's give you some idea. Um, uh, he became MP, so he was MP in Bermondsey from 1922, with 1 year out, until 1945. So he was a long time Quaker MP, but he wasn't into politics in my sense. So therefore, he says at one stage, well, of course, I was an MP in Parliament, but Ramsay MacDonald could never put me in the cabinet. I wasn't there for power. I was there for concern. And I couldn't be in the cabinet because I always voted against all the defence expenditure.
Mm.
I couldn't be in Parliament because it was my stated objective to close as many pubs in Britain as I could. And they didn't think that was a vote winner. So he was a non-starter as a politician in my sense. A politician in my sense is power politics, someone who's interested in power. The people in politics, MPs that I liked, they are people who want to influence opinion. They want to change the culture. They want to change people's mindset. Uh, they're working in decades. They're not working in 5 years or the next 4 years. And they're long term. They're people who want to raise the ethical standards of the human race,
Mm.
which is what Alfred wanted. So I was going to give you an example of what Brockway wrote. There was uh, there was the evening before a key election, and Alfred Salter gave his final speech of the election campaign to this packed audience of dockers and Bermondsey workers
Mm.
uh, and others, and lots of clergy, I think, were there as well. And uh, he gave his program, which was a program, by the way, of the ILP. He wasn't in the ILP, was the idealistic, ethical version of the Labour Party. It preceded the Labour Party, and so I'm I'm not talking about the ILP of the 1930s here, which was different. This was the previous ILP.
The
Of,
Independent Labour Party, is it?
yes, Independent Labour Party. This was the ILP of Keir Hardie. The ILP of the 1930s was Marxist. That was quite different. So yes, so he gave the program, and then he said, but to the horror of the chair of the meeting, um, a railway worker called Joe Craig, to his horror, Alfred said, and by the way, before we finish, in the interests of truth, I should say to you that if you elect me tomorrow, I will do my best. I will vote against all military expenditure and all wars that this country might undertake. I want not a penny spent on warfare. And secondly, if you elect me tomorrow, I will do my best to close every pub in Bermondsey. Um, and I should explain, by the way, that wasn't quite as mad as it looked. Temperance issue in those days was a feminist issue. It was a suffrage issue. So when he said that, he wasn't being quite as outlandish as you might think. Every woman in the audience would have loved him for that.
Understood, yeah.
Because
Yeah.
what happened in the slums, not just the slums, all working class districts, was that the men used to get their money on a Friday night, and by Saturday night, all the money was spent for the entire week, leaving the wife to get the groceries by borrowing money from other people. I mean, not all men were like that, but a lot of them were. My own grandmother was in that plight. So when she was a child, her mother used to send her to the pub on Friday evening, to the factory on Friday evening, and her job as a child was to get in front of her father as he came out and stop him, and he not allowing him to get to the pub until he'd given half his wages to her, or to stand outside the pub and there were lots of like a dozen girls standing outside the pub, trying to stop their fathers going in. So yeah, anyway, so that wasn't so so that wasn't quite as bad, but it was still pretty bad, considering there were dock workers there who fancied a pint, probably after that meeting. So he said that, and there was a hush. Brockway says, for about a minute. This bloke won't be supporting his country in a war. This bloke will close the pub. And there was this hush while they digested that. And then suddenly, people took to their feet and started applauding. And suddenly, the whole hall was applauding, was standing and clapping Alfred. And the chair stood up, who was very quick-witted Irishman. Oh no, he was Scottish, and said, there you are. Tomorrow, you will be voting for a man of principles. And the next day, Alfred won by a thumping majority because he'd told the truth. He showed he was a man of principle. He hadn't covered up from his audience that he would be voting in that unpopular way. He said to them, he actually says in the speech, if you don't like this, don't vote for me.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by politics. That's the sort of politics that I meant, that I could accept. Wasn't the sort of politics that my mum and dad argued about, about who was going to be prime minister. And then another Alfred Salter thing from the book that might interest you, another ethical example. I mean, there's a lad who was stoned in a church. The church was set fire to by mobs in the First World War because he opposed the war. His wife, Ada, was nearly burned to death at a meeting that set fire to the building that Ada was in. This is patriots waving Union Jacks were doing this. People proud of their country burning clergy to death. Well, they didn't succeed, but they tried. Um, and so this was one such case. During the war, he opposed the war, and the mobs were going around London, beating up people, including pacifist clergy, and waving their Union Jacks. And they came to the Salters' house in Bermondsey, armed with bricks and Union Jacks, and they'd smashed all the shops' windows on Tower Bridge Road because they were foreigners. The people who owned the shops were foreigners. They thought they were German, but they were Jewish with German names. Um, so, so they came to the house, and Alfred, courageous as ever, stepped outside and confronted them. And so he said to them, "Why are you here? I'm the doctor who brought your children into the world. I'm the doctor who looked after your parents when they were dying. Do you think I, as a doctor who has taken the Hippocratic oath, that I can support a war in which people are killed? My profession is to stop people being killed. Do you want me to turn what is a profound against my profound beliefs?" Anyway, he spoke like this, and Brockway said after a while they went quiet, and then they slunk off into the darkness of the night. And Alfred had won again by an ethical stand, based on spirit, but socially active as well. Um, so, but I was interested when I reread this book after Anne Hour's Salter lecture, and at the beginning I noticed it said at the beginning, "Oh, Alfred Salter and his equally remarkable wife, Ada." But then she was only mentioned a few times in the book. So I thought, well, what did she do, I wonder? So I started to research her as a historian and found lots of things that she did. Wow, she was amazing too. But no one took any notice of her because in those days women didn't count very much. I mean, they weren't even allowed to work really. My mother was sacked as soon as she got married,
Mm.
as was every other mother, because women weren't supposed to even work. Um, so, uh, so yes, I became consumed with interest in this Ada Salter woman. Spent a lot of time in friend's house, and went to Manchester to find in the archives there, and to Hull. Went around the country looking at all the archives that other historians hadn't bothered to look at, and got together this woman. So what did she do? She was started as a Methodist, and she from Northamptonshire, another Midlander, and she read the Methodist Times, and she was inspired by a very famous Methodist called Hugh Hughes. And he was organizing through his wife. I put that wrongly. His wife was organizing, and he mentioned in the Methodist Times. This is what I found out later. You always you go into it, and it's nearly always the woman who's organized everything. Same with George Fox, you know. It was Margaret who did all the organizing.
Yeah.
Not he didn't organize anything. Um, so so, so yeah. So she wanted to be a sister of the people and go into the slums of London. So but she couldn't. Women weren't allowed to leave the house on their own. How could she get to London? Eventually, her sister got married to somebody in London, and so she could go there because sister claimed to be her chaperone in London. So she got to London, and she became a member of the Sisters of the People and was trained in social work, essentially. Um, well, to cut a long story short, she eventually, there was a big catastrophe amongst the Methodists, and she left Bloomsbury and went to Bermondsey to a settlement there. It was still a Methodist settlement, but it wasn't a catastrophe in all of Methodism. It was a catastrophe in that particular place, and so she went and went to another Methodist settlement in Bermondsey, and so she was this very religious, very dedicated Methodist. And she met the doctor to the settlement, Alfred Salter, who was an atheist. And they got together. Wow, what a clash that was, you know. He was due to become a top doctor. He got the highest marks at Guy's Hospital that any student had ever had. He was going to straight to Harley Street, you know, with country houses and the lot. And he was an atheist, and she wasn't going to move. He'd fallen in love with her, but she wasn't going to budge from what she was doing. So he had to stay if he wanted to be married to her. So when they got married, he became a Quaker. It was the nearest thing to atheism of all. It was the nearest thing to atheism of all the religions on offer, and he had to be one of them if he wanted to marry Ada. And he was genuinely converted. Yes, she really convinced him, and he was a real Quaker. In the end, it took some years. So she eventually became a counsellor. You know, first woman counsellor, then first woman in London, and then first woman mayor in London. And then she unveiled this program in the 1920s in the slums. She believed that it wasn't enough to tend to the material needs of the poor. Well, she was certainly against charity, Lady Bountiful writing a check, but even more than that, she moved into the slums. She wouldn't live in the Bermondsey settlement, in the Methodist settlement. She moved into the slums herself, so she could experience the same as the slum dwellers. That was the first thing. But then she also believed that the conditions in the slums affected people's morale and their ethics. Mm. So she planted in the streets of Bermondsey 7,000 trees, 7,000 over 5 years. She vowed that everyone in Bermondsey should have a garden and become a gardener. Even those without any gardens had to become a gardener because she gave them window boxes, free window boxes. And the reasoning was this: if you become a gardener, You learn to tend and care for something. You plant a seed and it grows and you look forward to it the next year. And then you water it and you look after it and love it.
Mm.
And all the brutality of the slums, the hard edges that the half-starved dockers and their families had imposed upon them might drop away, and they might think outside themselves. Some love might come into their hearts. So, so this was her thinking. Um, and the same with the children. She built playgrounds for children wherever she could. She took over the churchyards and put playgrounds into the churchyards. Um, if land wasn't available, she made it available. She started building houses, model houses, so-called utopian houses, some of which are still there to this day. These council houses were different from the other council houses. They had gardens front and back. They had big windows so the light could come in, lots of light. Everything was ordered according to the light. um, and she, every house, oh, the houses, before she would pass them, the architect had to meet the slum women who were going to live in them and listen to what the slum women said and be told that they couldn't carry the bucket uh, from point A to point B unless he put the sink there, and be told that the stairs weren't wide enough to carry that up or carry a baby down or
Mm.
whatever. And this went on for months, of course. Um, Now, this was not exactly unprecedented. Um, they tried some things like that in Hampstead Gardens suburb, but in the slums, this was unheard of in the slums. This wasn't middle class Hampstead. Uh, this was people that nobody cared about. These were people who could die and no one would notice. These people did die and were found under staircases after they died. Um, uh, so she did all that, and Alfred was implementing tremendous healthcare program into the area, doing all sorts of innovative doctorly things at the same time. So they're a wonderful couple, and uh, in the and Ada had got lots of strings to her bow. In the First World War, she was in charge of the maintenance for COs on behalf of Quakers all over the country. Um, she, the police were arresting pacifists and Quakers. Uh, the COs were at one stage were regarded as the enemy. Bertrand Russell was arrested, and so Ramsay MacDonald gave Ada his flat
So,
to work.
conscientious objectors were regarded as the enemy. Is that what you just
At
said?
the beginning, they were, yes, of course, because they were traitors to the country.
Mm.
That's why their houses were attacked and their relatives were scorned in the streets. Yeah, they were traitors, and they were treated. They were beaten up by soldiers in the military camp. They were, as traitors. Don't forget that conscientious objection was new then. It was. This is an innovation. It wasn't something that anyone knew about. These were skivers who wanted to get out of sticking up for their country while the others died. These were the scum of the country, according to John Ball. John Ball was the main patriotic organ at that time. So, uh, yeah, so she did all that. Um, um, she opposed the Treaty of Versailles. some of her group went to the Treaty of Versailles to plead with them not to impose reparations because that would lead to Hitler. They didn't say that. That would lead to authoritarian rule in Germany, which turned out, in fact, to be Hitler. Keynes, Bertrand Russell, D.H. Lawrence all predicted that reparations would lead to fascism, something like fascism. And it did, of course, as we all know. That was the fruit of reparations, because the people who were starving in Germany didn't see the sense of it because they didn't start the war. Their fathers might have done, but they didn't. And so she did all of that. So I wrote this book. I wrote the biography of Ada Salter, which came out in the end of 2015. And by that time, I thought I really should become a Quaker member because this woman has convinced me.
Mm.
So I applied to become a Quaker member. And of course, I always joke about this because I say I was convinced by a dead woman. I was convinced by a woman who died the year I was born. uh, so, um, hmm. So I applied for membership in 2016. I nearly didn't become a member. It went badly. They, the Quakers had this thing that I called an interview, and they called a visit, but it felt like an interview. And they sent two people along, and suddenly I thought, I'm not going to be a Quaker member. This is the end of the road for me. There were two people came along, and first of all, they wanted to know my, rather like you said today, what's your faith background, as it were. And so I started to tell them a little bit, not all I've told you today, but a little bit. And the man who was there cut me short. He said, as far as I'm concerned, the Bible is a load of rubbish. Now, I don't believe everything in the Bible because I'm a historian and I know that the Bible contradicts itself in a number of places. And I know that the book of Genesis was written by three people at three different times. So it's not that I believe in the holiness of Scripture, but neither did I accept this either. If this was what Quakers meant, I didn't want it. But I thought of Ada, who certainly did believe that the Bible had a role, and Alfred. And I thought of the other sort of good Quakers that I knew and tried to close my ears to this rather alien prospect. But then the other person, I got into conflict too. She said, well, what do you think of Quaker faith and practice? Because you really need to at least understand that if you're going to be a Quaker member. So I said, well, I've read it as instructed, but and I agree with all the discipline parts. I knew all the rules and regulations, but there's a second part which I didn't think should be in the book, which is quotations from historical people who I know. And well, one or two are a bit wrong historically, but on top of that, that's so right wing. They're so political. I said, there's not a single quote in Quaker Faith and Practice from Ada and Alfred Salter for a start. There's not a single quote in Quaker Faith and Practice for any of the other Quaker socialists. There isn't even a quote in Quaker Faith and Practice from Philip Noel Baker, who was a Quaker socialist, member of the Quaker Socialist Society, who won the Nobel Prize, who won a medal at the Olympic Games. He's
Mm.
not mentioned either. So I can't really say that I can accept the second half of Quaker Faith and Practice because it's so political. And I'm against politics. Politics shouldn't have been brought into it. And it obviously has been brought into it. By somebody unknown. Uh, so there was then this sort of stalemate, and I said, "Well, I could take you for a walk in the park." So I took them for a walk in the park and showed them all the community things that Sheila and I do in the community there. And I showed them the statues of Ada and Alfred Salter and the Ada Salter Garden, which is a beautiful garden that Ada built herself. She designed it and built it herself, another remarkable thing. And went to the river and showed her the statues by the river. And they sort of said, "Well, Graham, I mean, all these things you've done and your love for Ada and Alfred, you do seem to be a genuine Quaker." Despite your rather wrong-headed sort of attachment to the Bible and your curious views on Quaker faith and practice. Anyway, they reported all this back to Westminster. I understand there was a little bit of a discussion then, but I was allowed to be a Quaker member after all. I got through, but it was touch and go, I think. So then I became a Quaker member. I think that's it then, isn't it? I mean, isn't that what you asked me? You asked me
So,
to
so
tell
have you
you how I
changed your
became a
mind?
Quaker, didn't you?
That
So
that was
done
that
it,
was
haven't
that was only 9 years ago. So have you changed your mind since then? Are you still content being a member? Because you seem to have all sorts of questionable approaches to things. So have you changed
questionable,
your
did you
mind,
say?
or are you still content to be a
Did you
Quaker?
say questioning or questionable? Declare yourself.
Questionable, I said. Well,
No, well, yes, of course. I've got a lot that's happened in the last 9 years. At one time, I thought of giving up my Quaker membership and thought about it deeply. Um, that was in 2022. But I'm still here, and I still think that Quakers are a force for the good, and I still think that they might be able to continue, despite all those statisticians who tell us that Quakers and Methodists will be extinct by 2040 on the present extrapolation. Despite all that, I still think something will survive. It might not be the same as we have now, but I'm guardedly optimistic. But also, you see, I was attached from the beginning to this ethic, Albert Schweitzer's ethic, the idea that you can go from mythical to spiritual to ethical to social, and it's all one continuum. It's all the same thing, and that you can't counterpose the social against the rest, or you can't counterpose the spiritual against the rest.
hmm.
Quakers were born in the middle of a revolution. Quakers were born in the middle of a civil war. When George Fox became a Quaker under the guidance of Elizabeth Hooton, another woman, when she converted him to Quakerism in 1647, convert is an exaggeration, but when she brought him into it, um, he uh, he was 2 years after the execution of the Archbishop of Canterbury. and 2 years before the execution of Charles I. Now, that was a revolution. Uh, and again, the Quakers who fought against the slave trade, that came at the time of the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. And the Salters, the Boer War, the Russian Revolution of 1905. And I mean, so Quakers were always in the thick of it uh,
Mm, mm,
in revolutionary times of great social upheaval. And that's why Fox's journal is full of this stuff about equality and criticizing the establishment of his day, um, because that was in the atmosphere of his time.
mm,
That was part of it, and I think that will continue. I think it will continue forever.
Yeah, and I mean, as you know, you've watched a few of these interviews, and you know, I keep saying that I think there's an awful lot of politics, and we're forgetting about the kind of the religious and the spiritual. And I suppose it's not so much that I don't think that it's worthwhile doing that, because I do. But what worries me is, I suppose the short way of saying it is burnout.
Mhm.
That if you don't have a continual standing in the light, you might call it, whatever metaphor you use. I mean, you talk about George Fox's journal, and you talked about, about the importance of the Bible. You haven't said much about what your ongoing spiritual practices are, but if you don't have that and you just relentlessly throw yourself
Yeah,
into
yeah,
protest or politics,
yeah. Well,
what
this is
what concerns me is that, I mean, you talked about depression actually, this kind of gloom sets
not
in.
clinical depression. Yeah.
No, but
Mm.
but I mean, I think that, there's a sort of a gloom that sets in, and I think, and that's what I don't like,
Yes,
if I'm
yes,
honest.
you're right. It was definitely what I experienced in the 70s, and that was why I had such a long period of gloom, if you like, in the 80s and 90s, because I wasn't standing in the light. I got so engrossed in the social struggles with the strikes and with um, the women's movement and the the anti-racist movement. I got so enveloped in that I wasn't standing in the light, as you say.
Mm,
I lost touch. Although I was committed to the social, I did lose touch with it, and I paid the price of that afterwards
mm,
because I had lost touch with it, and it took me 20 years to get
mm.
back to it.
And
Uh,
do you see that in the present day? I mean, you talked about, turmoil of ages past, but I mean, we're living through what feels like a fairly politically tumultuous period now. I think that's how people are experiencing it. Um, and I see people sat in Quaker meeting generally looking a bit depressed, talking about how hopeless and helpless and worried and scared they are. And you see, as you'll know, because I go into prisons and stand alongside people in despair, I find it, obviously there's a great deal of sadness and upset in the first part of a conversation with somebody, but actually it then it then leads you to the light, it leads you into a hopeful state, if you see what I mean.
mm, uh, I don't think the present period is a revolutionary period at all. If
Okay.
there was a revolutionary period, there would be revolutions. The period that we're living now, and since perhaps the Second World War, is a quiet period. I avoid using the word quietist because that means you believe in it, but it is a quiet period, relatively speaking. And the problems we have, I think, are the problems of quietism, uh, of, of a quietism in a quiet period, rather than the other way around. If I was to compare the position of Quakers now to another period of history, it would be the early 18th century. We're in that sort of period where the revolutions are done and in the past, and the there's a new era opening up where Quakers have to readjust. So the I think the depression that you talk about might be because the Quakers are too political, in my sense, that they take notice of politics, which I don't, and so uh, they might be, this depression might be because they don't like Brexit or they don't like Trump or because um, they they don't like foreigners coming into the country or something like that. Now those things to me are secondary issues, and the primary issues are human issues. The primary issues are um, war, poverty, climate change, well, actually, environment, which includes climate change, but I think environment is a better word, pollution. Um, and I think hatred. So the world is beset by war, poverty, environmental problems, and hatred. And uh, yeah, uh, all the other issues are secondary. And if you regard them as subsidiary questions, they look different. They don't look
Well,
they they don't look like life and death.
would you not say that many Quakers nowadays are worried about hatred of, as you say, perhaps people who don't like so much immigration, and say we
Yeah.
have too much illegal immigration, for
Well,
example. So they
well
worry about that hatred. They
mm,
worry about climate change and degradation of the planet. Um, they worry about, well, I mean, people seem to be very, very worried about Elon Musk in particular, it
mm,
seems.
mm,
Um, so there does seem to me to be some of what you just said
mm.
is actually what concerns
Oh
people.
yes, yes, sure, yeah. No, I was just pointing out though that sometimes a line isn't drawn between the issue and the personality, or between the issue as a social and human question and the issue as a party political or power politics question. And that's the distinction I've always drawn. And it's too easy to get drawn into the trap, I think,
Mm, mm.
uh, of I mean, uh, a few years ago, there was a demonstration at friend's house, and which I was participant in. And the slogans were, I know what it was. It was to stop Trump visiting Britain. So there were all sort of placards saying, "We hate Trump" and "Down with Trump." And
Mm.
uh, um, I made the point. I remember making the point at friend's house that I can't have any part of this really. Um, I'm, and in fact, the placards from the Quakers didn't have those particular things on them, but the march did. And I said, well, because it's not the person who's the problem, you know. Um, if if Trump is assassinated tomorrow, you'll get the same or worse. It's not
Mm.
uh, it, it's not the person
Mm.
that is the issue really, and also it's not the party. So uh, what it is you've got to look from the, the global perspective, the human perspective, um, the perspective of love and truth. If you that's what ethical means. It means getting out of this party politics stuff and
Mm.
this interpersonal stuff. I mean, I hate the television news, because it's all about this person hating another person.
Mm.
Uh, you know,
Because you see, I say that Quakers today have too much politics. Do you disagree then?
well, I'd make the same distinction. Um, if if we're talking about movements, uh, and if you're talking about uh, issues of ethics, Quakers don't have enough. If you're talking about politics in the sense of uh, what the Quaker MPs want, or what the policies are on certain questions, like what the policy on Gaza is, or something like that, then that's a different question altogether. Uh, it's I mean, I've had some. You you may have noticed if you've read The Friend. I've had some clashes myself uh, on some of these issues, and uh, and it's a matter of trying to keep to the ethical, and on the one hand opposing. I don't you like to use the word right wing. It's not, because that brings politics into itself. The right wing of Quakers, the conservative Quakers with a small c, shall we say, conservative Quakers with a small c. Um, I there are those, and then there are also the Quakers at Friend's House, the organisation, the corporation, the legal charity, um, which also operates politically more and more increasingly as a political organisation
Mm.
and not as a ethical organisation. It takes decisions on on matters of calculation, of reputation, of marketing and PR, and not on ethical truth, love, simplicity, or even wider. I mean, even wider than that. And so I've had clashes over that. That was why I said in 2022 I considered giving up my membership, because that gave me rather too much trouble than I was prepared to take.
Mm.
But it just depends what you mean by political. Some people would say that was political, but uh, the the people at Friend's House see it as a funding crisis. They've got to look after the funds of Quakers. They've got to look after the membership and the staff. They have a responsibility to run the organisation and so forth. But I would say they shouldn't let those concerns overcome their commitment to Quaker ethics and Quaker spirituality.
Mm.
Uh, they should keep it. They should make those financial concerns and organisational concerns secondary
Mhm.
in their
Yeah. Well, it's like
in
all
plans.
organizations, isn't it? Organizations in the end become about keeping people in their jobs that they've been in for
Yeah,
decades. Um, I mean, I suppose my key point is that I wish there was rather fewer pronouncements about the various world conflicts and more call to the spiritual practice that we offer and reminding people that this is a spiritual movement.
mm,
And I suppose because I don't see enough of that, I match it to the the doom and gloom that I see, so
Mm.
that we get more worry about the climate, more worry about Gaza, more worry about all these kinds of things, and more doom and gloom and depression, that's what bothers me at the moment, you know.
Well, I think I disagree with you to some extent because the the counterposing of spirituality against the social is something that I don't think is healthy because I believe that the two go together. And so if you start saying if the social people uh, start poo-pooing the Bible and the spiritual, I'm against it. And if the spiritual people distance themselves from the social ones, I'm against it. The world is full of polarizations. The whole thing about Brexit and Remain and it, you know, all the issues are now polarized in a way they never used to be.
Mm.
And that is very dangerous because that's what leads to hatred, because there's no reasoning, there's no ethical evaluation. You you look at an issue, you decide which side you're on, you hate the other side. There's no discussion. That's how it goes. Now, for example, I'll give you an example. Yeah, I'm trying to think. An example of where the social is the spiritual, where I felt really spiritually moved. So we were involved in an organization called Defend Our Juries. Uh,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I've heard.
yes, you may have heard of it. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that I'm involved in it, but I support it. So they organized a demonstration, Quakers organized a demonstration at the other side of London Bridge. And this was outside in Grace Church Street. It was outside the original courtroom where William Penn uh, stood up to the judge and said,
Mm.
let the jury decide. And the judge said, no, the jury has got to do as I say. Uh, so the organizers went to the monument, which is I don't know if you know, but the other side of London Bridge. It's a tall monument built at the end of the Fire of London to commemorate the Fire of London. It's just like an obelisk going up into the sky. And there's a square around it. So we decided we'd have a Quaker silence in the square in the middle of London. So we had this Quaker silence. It was absolutely stunning. Somehow, we all sat in this square, and somehow, one of these wonderful Quaker silences, which envelops you in its cloak, uh, took place. And there were passers-by, tourists, and they'd walk into this square briskly, and then they'd start to speak in hushed voices. Nobody told them to do that. They started to talk in hushed voices. And there was one not far back from me, they were Polish, and they started to whisper, what's this? What's this? What are they doing? But they whispered. They didn't talk in a normal voice. And and so I thought, well, this is it. This is what it should be. Forget this. These people are too spiritual. These people are too social. This is the social and the spiritual come together.
Mm. Well,
Like at my first
absolutely.
lecture.
Absolutely. And I don't disagree with that, you see, in that I just think that these political statements, if they create worry and fear and doom mongering and they lead people away from a spiritual experience, then
Mm.
this is what I have, concerns about.
Well, what you have to remember, I think, is that those statements are usually done for PR or for marketing or for uh, even commercial reasons. They're not done out of faith. And even I'm including some of the Friends House ones here.
Mm.
So, I mean, the question the two or three questions I've got heavily involved in. One was the question of William Penn removing his name from Friend's House, which I objected to as a historian. And I can't go into all the arguments here, but the fact was that Fox and Penn were committed against slavery. They were opponents of slavery. And all the abolitionists in the 19th century, from Woolman onwards, honored the name of William Penn. And the black slaves that Lincoln uh, tried to deal with in the American Civil War erected something in honor of Penn when they were liberated. Why? Because although in the 17th century they had slaves and you couldn't get rid of them unless you wanted to get shot by the authorities, because the slave lobby was very, very strong. And Penn had got troops, there were British troops in New York. He had a gun at his head. So unless he got some of his friends to do this protest against slavery, called the Germantown protest. But they were people that he recruited to Quakers himself, but he couldn't say anything. So I was devastated that this hero, one of my heroes, Penn, he was the one who got us British juries, who got us the Toleration Act,
Yeah.
Religious toleration. He shouldn't be shoved aside. So I asked about it, and they said the answer I got from someone inside Friend's House was, "Oh well, yeah, you shouldn't worry about that, Graham. When Black Lives Matter came up, we had to do something about that, and someone hit upon the idea of doing the William Penn, and so it seemed a good idea. There was nothing in it.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't done like as if they'd researched William Penn or knew anything about him. They didn't even dislike him. They did it as a sort of business process. And the same with Jeremy Corbyn being banned, you see, had the same there. That when you look at the document which they issued, giving their reasons why they were banned, the top one, and it was the top one for them, was reputational damage.
Mm. With whom?
And so, yeah, like that's the end of Quaker's relationship with CND for a start. And can you think of the early Quakers? George Fox saying, "Well, I don't think we'll do this protest
No.
in Doncaster because we've got to work out the reputational damage.
Well, exactly.
I'll make a phone call I'll get on my mobile to Margaret and see if she can sort something out with the marketing department."
But a friend of mine was saying that she wanted to write something about Elizabeth Fry, and I think there was some anniversary of some kind recently, and she wasn't allowed to mention Elizabeth Fry because this is now apparently a dog whistle for some kind of anti-trans sentiment because, of course, Elizabeth Fry was campaigning for single-sex spaces, however long ago that
Single
was.
sex business, yes.
So,
Yeah.
so again, it's a very similar kind of issue, isn't it? A kind of a fairly simplistic notion to
Mm. Well,
what's the word? Cancelling these iconic people of our past.
yes, and the the bureaucracy has to be separated from the political left and right or conservative and radical wings of of Quakerism. It is a separate thing. On the other hand, it can be influenced by either wing. So with uh, with conservative Quakers who want to make Quakers less radical, more accepted by the establishment, getting rid of, well, keeping out Ada and Alfred Salter from Quaker faith and practice might be desirable for them. Getting rid of opposition to the slave trade by saying, oh, well, there were lots of Quakers involved in the slave trade. We weren't really opposed to it. Might be good for conservative Quakers. Getting rid of the COs by saying, oh, well, lots of Quakers fought in the war. Lots of Quakers weren't as stupid and fanatical as those COs. Makes you acceptable to your Anglican vicar or
Mm.
to the Archbishop of Canterbury. So I'm not saying that happens in many cases, but it can happen. And similarly on the left, no, I should avoid these words. Similarly on the radical wing, that's the conservative wing, on the radical wing of Quakers, you also get reactions like, oh, this person is anti-trans. That means that they're right wing. That means they support Trump. That means we hate them. So, uh, so this happens.
Mm.
Uh,
Mm.
I'm afraid.
So what's your hopes for the future of Quakers then? I mean, you said a little bit about it just now, but I mean, where do you see we are at the moment, and where do you see it going? And indeed, what should we
Oh,
do about it?
sorry.
What
What-
should we do about it to get it on a better
Yeah,
path?
yeah. Well, naturally, as a radical, I will say that radical actions increase people's awareness of Quakers, bring Quakers in, they defend our juries. Some of the climate actions, not all of them, some of the climate actions, like Rajan, uh, Rajan's powder at Stonehenge, for
Mm.
example, was good non-violent Quaker action. Um, some of those will bring in young people um, and will make, well, more, it's not just that, it will make Quakers fulfill the ethical compulsion that they've always had, that we're always famous for. The, many Quakers have joined Quakers for, in fact, oh, I heard you were opponents of the slave trade and you've done good work in the prisons, that sort of thing. Um, if you keep that going instead of closing it down, then Quakers can still grow. I'm very much against the Future of Quakerism conference, which I attended online, which assumes that Quakers are into decline and fall, which assumes Quaker meeting houses will be closed, uh, which makes no attempt at all to grow Quakers or to expand their activity, just accepts that the membership will go down to 8,000, 6,000, and so on. Mind you, they have a shock coming when it gets to 6,000, because the organisations that I've belonged to in the past, when it gets below 6,000, there
Mm.
is civil war in that organisation over who has the remaining assets of that, who controls the remaining assets. So if it gets down that far, they're going to be in trouble. But there's this sort of complacency um, that's, well, I don't like it anyway. I mean, I don't like this thing that the Quakers shouldn't spread the message, that that Quakers shouldn't bring people in. I'm not going to say convert, but shouldn't bring people into Quakers. I mean, in the 80s, when I was in despair, I went along to a few Quaker members. A few Quaker meetings. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody took my name.
Yeah,
Nobody asked why I was there.
yeah, yeah.
So yes, I think Quakers could do an awful lot by being more active
Mm.
and by promoting this ethical agenda, a mixture of social and the spiritual. there's a lot to be done on that, and not to be frightened about, you know, being politically incorrect, but to do what the light, where
Yes.
the light leads you, you know. Uh,
Well, that's great. Well, we've solved it all, Graham, I think.
so yeah, I think we fixed it, Emma. No
Well,
problems anymore.
well, that's great. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Really, it was good. It was good
Yeah,
getting all that out.
right. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.